and partly even the world of China, where he did spend a good chunk of time in the early 1980s. But it's also because many of the ideas and insights and research streams and agendas, if you will, that he was part of in the late 1960s, they have been unjustly neglected and forgotten, but they do have a lot to teach us about how to design technologies that are more oriented towards the people, towards making us into more complex, sophisticated, diverse, and idiosyncratic people. And it's not traditionally how we think about technology. We tend to think that technology mechanizes us. Technology turns us into automatons or robots or machines. And that's how a lot of people also on the left have traditionally thought about technology, that it's something that we need to be suspicious of, that's something that we need to be able to control, that it's something that dehumanizes us by turning us into some kind of auxiliaries that are no longer needed. Warren and his colleagues' perspective was very different. It was a way to think of technology as a perpetual engine of difference, a perpetual engine of variety and diversity, something that could let us become different from what we were when we started using the technology. And I will give you a couple of examples as we move on, but I think it's very important to understand that part, that they were working on what they called soft and responsive technologies. And the key idea that held them together was a notion of responsiveness very different from our own. When you think about responsive technologies today, you are probably thinking about technologies that adapt to you, that get personalized to your needs. It might be your smartphone showing you the news that it infers based on your prior interests that you have documented somehow. It could be Spotify presenting you with a playlist composed entirely of songs that somehow fit within its understanding of your taste. It could be Netflix showing you only recommendations to films that are similar to films that you have seen before. What I'm saying is that the technologies that we have today, they are engines of perpetuating sameness. Right? They're engines of narrowness, and there is a reason for that, because a lot of people designing those technologies thought that we are rational, complete human beings with established tastes and established, aesthetic judgment and political agendas, and technologies should just serve us the way servants who know us well serve us. Or butlers or slaves. There are all sorts of imagery that was used to describe this paradigm in the 1960s and onwards. What people like Warren and his colleagues in the lab were thinking about was more technologies as craftsmen or artisans or pedagogues. Right? And if you think about those three, craftsmen, artisan, and pedagogues, what ties them together, it's not the idea that they need to give us exactly what we want to satisfy some pre-existing desires. It's that there is something to be learned. We are never truly finished. We are open-ended, fluid, ambiguous human beings who can become even more complicated and perhaps more, we can develop new tastes. We can move in completely new and unpredicted directions, right? And this is what good pedagogues do. They let us discover certain hidden potentialities within ourselves, which they can help us cultivate so that we can maybe set ourselves on a different path in life. And that's, at a very high level of abstraction, what their technologies in the lab were supposed to deliver. They were supposed to get us out of the routines and rituals of industrial society with mass production and standardized objects where everything was the same, which today's digital technology kind of replicated and reinvented, presenting sameness as diversity, into a world where everything was flexible, everything was fluid, and becoming, which is a very important term for Warren, was the overarching value. We were not the Homo economicus of, traditional conventional economic theory, who is a rational human being who has stable preferences that might evolve but nonetheless remain consistent. No, we were always open-ended, open to the world, and by mastering new skills and acquiring new aesthetic taste and judgments, we would be able to become even more complicated and even more open to the world. And I think it's a very subtle but nonetheless crucial difference between the technologies of personalization and adaptiveness that we got and technologies that could have been. And that's why I've been so drawn to uncovering this other side to what we have lost, because you can see that it's an agenda that's it's not at all Luddite and it's not anti-technology, right? You could use sensors, algorithms, intelligence, responsiveness, all of the technical features that we are currently using, but use them for a very different project to produce a very different kind of a human being, and then have them interact with each other in a much more enriched way.
Yeah, so this made me think that the type of responsive technologies that we have today, they do respond to us, but they respond to only the features of us that they are able to measure or able to pick up, which could be random, which is one thing, but that it also then it almost can freeze us as those people we were or are at that time, whereas what this is trying to imagine is a technology that actually helps us become more of ourselves, to change, but also perhaps even more importantly to understand the relations we form part of with other people. Mm-hmm. And that is somehow the sort of core notion of the cybernetic idea, and that's where the word ecological comes in to the lab.
Sure. Well, one way, again, you're raising a lot of issues, and I'm just trying to make sure we kind of cruise through them in the most efficient manner. So one useful distinction to understand how they differed from everybody else in that space in the late 1960s, and just to situate it, Warren was working in Boston, right? So we're talking about an environment very close to MIT, where he spent time at MIT as a kind of researcher and then as a director of an educational project. And his colleagues also spent time at MIT. One of them got a PhD from that institution. Another one was working on a very important project trying to design a Mars rover for NASA. So we're not talking about artists or amateurs, we're talking about people with actual technical expertise in matters of cognition, perception, computers, and so forth. So it's not by any means an artistic project, and you shouldn't think about it that way. They were really trying to build actually existing usable technologies. This is one thing that I think it's very important for us to remember. But the distinction I wanted to maybe make more salient in my response is the distinction between how forward-looking thinkers and experts in the technology sphere at the time thought about computers and how this crowd at the lab thought about it. For the most forward-looking people outside of the lab, the dominant paradigm was that of human augmentation. So it was the idea that computers can augment human intellect and human productivity. That's why we ended up with, the computer mouse, which was actually invented by the same person who started first theorizing this idea of human augmentation, Douglas Engelbart, with whom Warren had some interactions. Their idea was very much geared to the needs of the military-industrial complex, and it came out of the needs of the military to build radar systems that you could monitor by using screens and computers. This is where the initial notion of interactivity in the needs of human augmentation comes from. It's from the idea that you have people with keyboards looking at screens where you see moving targets indicating what's the radar is detecting. And this is what inspired a person like Engelbart to then build an interactive computer system so that you can be a more productive worker, possibly working for the Pentagon, but maybe also sitting in the office somewhere, so that instead of using punch cards and going to these big mainframe computers, which is how computers were in the 1960s, you can have a more personal experience So the computer would be smaller, you'll have a keyboard, you'll have a mouse, you'll have a screen, but the use of all of that equipment was still primarily to augment your productivity, to make sure that you can do more of what it is you already wanted to do with this new interface and this new technology. What this very specific lab on Lewis Wharf, which is the address in Boston where they were, wanted to do was not human augmentation, it was human enhancement. And that's a term that Warren used, and this is another interesting chapter in his life, because, which you might find surprising for someone whom you may not have heard of, but before going to MIT, he was actually also, those periods overlap, but he also spent time working at NASA as a consultant. So he was actually meeting astronauts, some of them returning from space, and working also on understanding how to make the space capsule, right, which is where astronauts would travel to space, more kind of likely to ensure that they would survive. So how do you train the astronauts some extra skills that they need by interacting with sensors and monitors in the space capsule that would allow them to survive in the most hostile conditions possible, which is the outer space? This is how Warren came up with this idea of human enhancement, that ultimately you can develop deeper ways of observation, deeper ways of perceiving the world and perceiving our own body by essentially outputting some of the parameters like heart rate or temperature or where our eyes are moving in what direction, right? By making people aware of how their bodies are responding to certain environments, you can actually develop new perceptual capacities in people. And that partly came out of another project that I don't have much time to go into that Warren was involved with, which was working with the blind children, with blind talented adults who developed extra talents to compensate for the lack of sight. So they developed a deeper sense of hearing, or a deeper sense of touch, a deeper sense of smell. And Warren essentially wanted to use computers and technologies to develop this kind of skills that both astronauts in the space capsule and the talented blind individuals develop in ordinary people. So computers as ways of enhancing us, right? And letting us perceive and think and experience the world in more profound way, as opposed to computers as just things that can augment our cognitive processes and do counting faster or do text composition more efficient, right? And you can see how the first paradigm of human augmentation is immediately open to risks and disruption from the world of artificial intelligence, because ultimately it's about taking human cognitive processes and trying to automate them, even though initially you're just augmenting them. The second paradigm, which is all about creating deeper, richer, more complex human beings capable of perceiving more, is not at all open to being disrupted by AI, because you're not trying to automate anything. You're trying to use technology to give people the capacities they don't have. Like, think about it as suddenly being able to perceive certain musical rhythms if you have been going to the opera for a decade, being able to understand Mandarin if it's spoken around you, having studied Mandarin for a couple of years. They saw that technology would allow us to achieve that level of extra insight when it comes to perception, touch, interaction, but also eventually thinking holistically. And this is how ecology comes into it, because the whole idea that they had was that by building these complex interactive systems that were not linear and that in a way did not respond to us in a predictable algorithmic way, people would be able to grasp that living systems are like that they are non-linear, they have complex dynamics, and by having people even play with this ecological cybernetic toys that they were building, people, and especially children, would be able to learn this language of complexity, right? And again, you can see how from very simple insight that our perception can be enhanced, they moved out eventually to how even our, to use a fancy term, cognitive mapping of the world can be enhanced, because this is what ecology ultimately for them was. It was about the ability to present the interrelated nature of all these things and factors that usually our instrumental perspective on technology, we think of technology as just a tool, on its own, without any embeddedness in social, economic, political, and cultural relations, conceals.
And I mean, this is pretty sort of mind-blowing stuff in a way, I think. And I've been able to listen to the podcast in advance, and in some of the episodes, I feel like, whew, they were on the brink of really figuring out something huge. And then other times, I feel like, oh, I didn't quite get there. It didn't actually produce anything in the last instance. And so they didn't actually produce anything in the end, more or less. And today they think of the technology that we do have as pretty useless and not at all what technology should have been. But is there any way to think of it as more concrete?
Well, I mean, look, ultimately the way I think about technologies is as systems, right? And systems, their survival and their viability depends on how many different actors or parts are composing it, right? Of how many elements it consists. So obviously a technological system that has the Pentagon, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, venture capital, the military-industrial complex, MIT behind that, in everything else being equal, is going to outlive a system that has 6 guys with a very radical idea about technology working in a lab. I mean, they will be defeated by it regardless of how you set it up, unless they're really clever and they manage to kind of guerrilla style manage to outbid the system, right? So the odds were against them from the very beginning. The interesting part about their particular setup, especially in light of Warren's later kind of political metamorphosis, is that 2, but you can even say 3 of the partners that he had in the lab out of the 6 came from very prominent, well-off families. One of them, just to give an example, was the great-grandson of John D. Rockefeller, at some point one of the richest people in the world. So in theory, you know, for me it was also a very tantalizing possibility, because you rarely find such institutions as that lab, because they really were the renegades who broke away from the military-industrial complex. They were not in any way dependent on MIT. They at some point even refused taking money from it, and Warren at some point didn't even want to get a tenured appointment there. But they also didn't necessarily need to sell themselves to companies, right? At least at the very beginning, because one of the rich benefactors just said, I'm going to pay for it for 18 months, and we see how far we get. And for me, it kind of opens an interesting alternative virtual history where, you know, that's in those conditions in America, without, you know, mobilizing the trade unions with which they had no connection, without mobilizing more radical parts of the counterculture like the Black Panthers and others, which of course had their own issues to deal with. They were hardly thinking about building responsive technologies. They were running away from the FBI. You had a source of funding that could have turned things radically, right? A lot of other things happened. It was, they went after an enormous task conceptually, because if you think about what they were trying to do, philosophically, I think even they didn't understand it fully, how immense the task was, because if their idea of what technology is like, what human action is like, if both of them were correct, and I think they were correct, it would require a revision of our traditional social theories. You know, you'll have to throw away part of Max Weber and Habermas along with him, because it relies so much on the idea of instrumental action, right? And a lot of economics too you'll have to throw away, because for them ultimately action was, their notion, sorry, now we're getting really theoretical, but their notion of action was much closer to the notion that pragmatists had. So action is something that was creative, revisable. In one of his articles, Warren writes that choice, it's not intellectual, it's made by doing and exploring. Try to sell that idea to an economist, that, you know, choice is not something that is already in your head for doing something, but it's something that emerges in you as you're interacting with your environment, right? And not only were they trying to revise the kind of the social theories that gave us all the shitty technologies that we ended up with, they were actually trying to build the technologies themselves, right? And this is where the personal side of the story comes in, because you have to understand that to get at that level of radicality, if you will, you really need to think different. And in some way, all of those 6 people, it was 5 women, 5 men and 1 woman, all of them did. But they were also going through a lot in their personal lives. And, Warren at that point had 5 children, and his marriage was falling apart, and and that is a typical situation of everyone in that kind of lab, right? So even if you, so you can imagine that 18 people with a lot of problems outside of their kind of cultural renegadeness, it was not exactly destined for success.
And their technologies don't have the potential for profit, and they don't have the potential to become weapons.
Well, they did want to. I mean, that was another side that I think was wildly utopian about them, in that they thought for a long time, at least Warren and his main partner in crime, so to say, Avery Johnson, for a while they did think that they would be able to convince corporate America to embrace their technologies, and that corporate America would take on this humanistic mission of making it because you have to understand another thing. Now, let me backtrack. So before Warren became a consultant to NASA and started working at MIT, and then came here and became member of AKP, he was a well-established psychiatrist and a pioneer of family therapy. So if you look at Warren in 1963, he's a very well-established member of American elite, has one of the senior people in the CIA as his client, as a psychiatrist. People know him in Washington. He's a big fish, right? And he has a lot of theories about what hurts people in America of early 1960s, right? And he thinks that all of them are becoming square and boring and regimented, and part of it has to do with unresponsiveness of industrial civilization, that everybody has to wear the same shoes and drive the same cars and live in the same housing blocks. And part of his technological rebellion germinates there. But if you think about it, I mean, the utopian idea informing it is that technologies can take on this therapeutic psychoanalytic function and make us kind of understand that things for us are much more open-ended than we thought, right? They kind of awaken us to the real richness and rich texture of experience. And great, and maybe if it was part of the National Health Service in the US, it would have worked. But they were expecting the likes of Coca-Cola and big shoe manufacturers and furniture makers to take on that project instead of building a simple chair that would just have a handle and you would be able to kind of make it respond to you. They thought it will have this sensors that will provoke you into becoming a different human being, right? I mean, I appreciate that as a project, right? It's very bold. But they were talking to the wrong audience. And, in the end, however rich his partners were, even they ran out of money and patience because they understood that. And Warren, I think, understood that too. And that's why he immigrated and left everything in America and got to Norway. It was just not realizable under the conditions of competitive capitalism in America of the early 1970s.
Yeah. And so Warren left America and he came here. And he became a member of AKP-ML, which is a group that doesn't get a lot of good press in Norway. But in your version of Brodey's story, meeting AKP-ML or becoming a Maoist is something that sort of sharpens his analytical outlook and his understanding perhaps of why his technologies have not succeeded, as you were saying. Could you say something more about that?
Sure. Well, you have to understand that before he immigrates, Warren does have a certain cultural and social profile in America already as a countercultural guru of some kind. He was he was close with Marshall McLuhan, for example. So McLuhan has been to that lab on Lewis Wharf. And when Warren's book came out, there was an ad in the New York Times with McLuhan saying, I'm going to be using this book in all my teachings. And McLuhan at that time was probably the most famous public intellectual in the world. So him saying that in the New York Times meant a lot. So by the end of 1972, Warren, is no longer big fish, just a big fish in psychiatry, but he's a big fish in counterculture, right? And he's dreaming about how different parts of counterculture will inter-network with each other. And this new entity that he started with his partner after the lab shut down was supposed to be that networking hub. They called it, and you will see how playful they were, they called it Ecology Tool and Toy. That was the name of the venture. They sort of will be a hub for, the hippies, the Maoists, there weren't many, but the Black Panthers, the psychedelic people going back to the land, the communes. They sort of that in America, this venture would be kind of a hub that would be teaching them about technology so they can be more tech literate, so to say, partly by using their products. That failed, and it didn't take off, again, for all sorts of reasons, including personal ones. And when he got to Norway and started interacting, living in a commune first, in kind of not a commune, a collective, you call them here, right? In Trondheim, he kind of gets to understand that there are certain dimensions to technology, including class, social relations, ownership, the degree of decentralization, citizen control over automation, all these questions that were widely debated at the time. I mean, just some of you who have been around at that time, you'd probably know that in the late 1960s, early 1970s, not just in Norway, but in Scandinavia as a whole, in Sweden especially, there were a lot of discussions about appropriate technology, alternative technology, people's technology. There were huge exhibitions and kind of shows dedicated to it in parallel, for example, with the huge environmental UN conference that was happening in Stockholm in 1972. So these issues of building technologies that were different from the mainstream was a fact of life, which kind of also got forgotten that such a way to talk about technology existed. There was a fact of life because people understood that the technologies that we did have at the time, mechanized architecture, or cars or trains, whatever you took from the kind of industrial world, or water pumps, they were designed the way they were designed because they were embedded in the capitalist system, and there were profitability incentives and imperatives that resulted in affecting the design. And that's why there was this whole push to build people's technology, alternative technology, appropriate technology, and so forth. So Warren kind of in this early stage, before he even joins AKP, he already kind of looks into his past self in America and looks at American counterculture, and he realizes that they were not posing the questions correctly. Because in America, there was a certain anti-systemic flavor and touch to kind of technology critique, that it was always about system. It was about bureaucracy. It was about, we need to deinstitutionalize society, as Stuart Brand once said in Holler's catalog, which was the Bible of US counterculture. And they were pretty libertarian in the kind of right-wing way to boot. So he starts looking back at the kind of American rebellion and the rebellion of US counterculture, and he understands that entire dimensions, political and economic ones, are missing. And he starts getting involved. He becomes a consultant to one of the factories to kind of understand how he can apply his human enhancement ideas to understand the noise landscape of the factory. And he goes and talks to the workers, and he does this empirical studies there. Then he joins all sorts of study groups by the workers themselves, and gradually he gets drawn into this kind of Maoist current that was getting stronger and stronger in Norway at the time. He becomes part of AKP, and eventually he ends up having, a medical degree and being a prominent psychiatrist, being friends with Marshall McLuhan and being at MIT and NASA. He becomes a manual worker in an iron foundry making Jotun, stoves for 2 or 3 years in the late 1970s when he's already 50. While hiding the fact of his kind of very bourgeois origin from the rest of the workers, to the point where his child, who was here, one of his children, was going to school here. He was not allowed to say to his classmates that his father was a doctor, and in America they were leading a very different life. But again, you have to understand that I think, I mean, I can give you a kind of a long answer, but Warren as a doctor, having kind of failed in his identity as a tech rebel, he did need to have something to fall back to, right? As a kind of as a backup identity. But you have to understand that at the time, American counterculture, for example, they looked down on doctors. They thought that doctors were experts and experts were bad, and their authority was challenged because they were linked to hospitals, and it was, you know, and I don't know to what extent this attack on expertise resurfaced in Norway, but in America, you know, to be a doctor at the height of counterculture was almost like being a military man, because you were part of the kind of the system. And Warren discovered that there was another use for medical expertise. You could actually be a doctor and help developing countries, and he discovered a book by a doctor who went and spent time helping Mao's China deal with its public health. A British doctor, Joshua Horn, I think was his name. So he wrote him a letter on his 50th birthday while being here in 1974, saying that he would like to volunteer his expertise to the cause, and asking him how his medical experience can help a country such as China get out of the underdevelopment. And eventually he ended up going to China to teach biocybernetics in the early 80s, which disaffected him somewhat from the fascination he used to have with Maoism of China, but it's a story for another time probably.
I think it's time if we could possibly ask the main person, Warren Brodey, if he could join us up here. We're deeply honored to have you come all the way from Boston, where you currently reside.
He's 100 years old, in case you don't know. So that's, we started when he was 90. 100.5.
So do you have anything you'd like to add, Warren, about your journey from Georgetown to Jøtul Peisfabrikker, or about our current predicament, or the two?
Well, first I will say I'm glad that so many people are here and they're welcome, and it's a joy to be a bit popular. And I have not always been so popular because I spoke more about what needs to be happening and wasn't happening and would not happen as long as people who really held the cards really were not interested in having new ideas set forth. And so I can say I wasn't very popular in those days. At the same time, I had my own friends, and at the beginning there were some very rich friends which helped me considerably, and who really were enchanted by my thinking. And then there was people who thought I was kind of crazy, and that's the way it was, and they were not really interested, and they were more involved with how do you maintain the old systems and not how do you look at them critically. So here we are. I'm glad to see you all. I'm rather surprised that so many people turn up. And it's a joy that you have come. Now, having said that, I thank you very much for inviting me and inviting us
Speak into the mic.
to be here. Now, what has been said is quite clear in many ways, and it's sort of there has been a revolution, and people don't necessarily believe in the old shit. They want something different, and that's fair enough. And the new thing is really giving respect to the old stuff, and at the same time enlarging it to see the broad spectra of what's really happening socially and what people care about, which is quite different than in the old days. And I don't know that I can say much more.
Thank you so much for your intervention. Maybe I could ask you, Evgeny, now that we have him here. You've been interviewing Warren for 10 years for your PhD thesis and then for this project. If you were to say, as brief as you can, no, what have you learned from Warren, if you were to sum it up? You already knew a lot of things.
How to tell a good story. Well, I mean, look, intellectually, of course, for me, it's been an eye-opening experience in that Warren found himself at the intersection of many different social circles: psychiatry, architecture, counterculture, technology, Maoism, and in that sense, he is completely unique in the intellectual landscape of that period. Certainly in the American landscape of counterculture, I don't know of anyone else who, I mean, you had cases where people got radicalized and they went from relatively bourgeois kind of groups to join the Weather Underground or something like that. But in his case, it's someone who came to a country where he literally had 2 phone numbers and didn't speak the language, and somehow inserted himself into the political process and seems to have enjoyed it tremendously. I interviewed one of his daughters who told me that in the late 1970s he would take her to all these demonstrations that were happening here in Oslo, and people were raising money for all sorts of causes in the third world, and they were all interrelated, and they didn't have any money, and she just couldn't understand why Warren was giving all the money that he had to the people collecting it. I mean, that's a bold choice, right? And I feel that not in terms of just the money, but in terms of the boldness and decisiveness with which he has been changing his life. So in that sense, he stayed true to what he's been preaching. Part of what he's been preaching is this importance of being open to becoming. So if you really need to evolve and move in a different direction, you have to be as determined and decisive and move in that direction, and without necessarily looking back. He's done that by abandoning psychiatry. He's done that by abandoning MIT. He's done that by abandoning being a cybernetician in the US and abandoning counterculture. He's done that by, essentially then even abandoning Maoism to some extent. So that level of decisiveness and being very clear and determined is something that I admire. What the podcast shows, I think, is that some of that came with costs, especially the people around him, which sometimes, we're just at the human level, too much to digest, but it's the kind of, balance that we all have to make for ourselves. But I do, I only understood the boldness of his moves once I left the intellectual plane, which was mostly the plane I was working on for my dissertation, and kind of tried to understand it more at a human level of, somebody in advanced, well, not advanced age then, but he was already pushing 50 when he decided to leave America and reinvent himself. And that's the kind of reinvention that takes courage.
It's getting really hot up here, so I think maybe we're going to end on that note. The podcast is going to be out in 2 weeks from now, but while you wait, you can listen to Santiago Boys, the other podcast. It's very inspirational. Warren's work is very inspirational, and Evgeny's work in tracking down Warren and showing it to a greater audience is the same. So I thank you both, and I thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.
Thank you.